Welcome to part two. Um, okay. So the question you were responding directly to was how DuBois and Washington are different, and just a little bit of the history. Frederick Douglass, and a lot of you have read him in classes with me or come across him someplace else. Douglass was a leader of the African American community in the years after the Civil War. Now, when he passed away, there was some shuffling around trying to find out who that primary spokesperson was going to be. For a little while, it was Booker T. Washington, but as you can see, his leadership wasn't really the most popular, and DuBois did eventually step in and take over. He actually was a founding member and a very prominent member of the NAACP, which began in 1909, I believe, and continues to this day to be the most prominent organization for equality in the African American community. It's called a National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, and anyone can join. Actually, I'm a member. It's a great organization. You get a really good magazine. So, I think it costs, what, 20, 30 bucks a year or something. So if you're interested, go ahead and join. And that just reminds me, in terms of language used to describe the African American community. Once upon a time, Negro or colored was acceptable, but not anymore. Let me just tell you the history of that. In the 60s, there was a real push to getting rid of Negro and colored and replacing that with black. And then as time passed, African American became more prominent. And so actually there are some older leaders, individuals in the African American community that still prefer black. Some prefer African American. So, but I think for our purposes, black or African American will be acceptable, but it's not advisable to use any other terms. Actually, what I'm seeing, just from my vantage point, I mentioned the NAACP and their magazine called The Crisis. What they use to refer to their community is black with a capital B, and white is listed with a capital W. So from my vantage point, that's what I'm seeing more and more of. So African American, black, upper, lowercase, for our purposes is going to be okay. All right, so just a little bit of side information there. Okay, so what you're seeing here between Douglass and DuBois is a very famous, effort to articulate, who we are as an African American community and what we are, who we are and what our struggles are and what our goals are as a community. Okay, so I think it's pretty clear. I think folks get this point. But let me just hit some highlights here. Washington, if you look over on page 160, oh, darn it. That's right, I gave you a link. So my page numbers aren't going to match with yours. So we're just going to have to roll with it here, folks. But this is in Washington's letter. He says, "It is at the bottom of life we must begin, not at the top." And then so, the question that raises is, Washington is basically saying we in the African American community, we have to prove ourselves before we can be given our rights. But, the question then has to be asked, if anyone has to prove anything, couldn't it be argued that white America has something to prove to the African American community? After all, it's white America that thought it was perfectly okay to enslave millions of African Americans for hundreds of years. Doesn't white America have something to prove, like by saying simply, "I'm sorry"? that we did this, what we did was wrong, and we will make some effort to make an amends. But no, I mean, for 100 years later, segregation was legal and everything else. You know, people who tried, even after years of slavery were over, to still impose second-class citizenship upon African Americans. And it's African Americans that have something to prove to white America. You know, who is the aggrieved party here? You know, who's the one that committed the wrong? Who's the one that needs to atone for what was wrong, right? Okay. So that's one point, of course, that DuBois is going to have a problem with. And then over on page 169, oh yeah, don't have page numbers. In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand, in all things essential to mutual progress. So I'll be saying more about this metaphor in a little bit, but you know, this is a perfectly lovely metaphor. You know, we all have hands. I think, well, not everybody does in the world, right? But for the sake of argument, I do, right? It's a nice metaphor. Separate fingers and a hand, and my fingers are separate because they each have their individual work to do. You know, when they pick something up, this is a picture of my sister when she was a baby. When they pick something up, right, so they have individual purposes. My sister will love it that I showed you her baby picture. You know, but so we all have individual tasks, right? But we're all working for the common good. You know, perfectly lovely metaphor. But was it really? You know, isn't that a way of justifying segregation, right? Okay, well, I'll come back to that. And look over on page 170. Yeah, don't know why I keep doing that. Force of habit. You don't have page numbers. This is towards the end of his Atlanta Compromise speech. The wisest among my race understand that the agitation of questions of social equality is the extremest folly, and that progress in the enjoyment of all privileges that will come to us must be the result of severe and constant struggle rather than of artificial forcing. So a lot of people would read this as just acquiescence. It's not even compromise, it's acquiescence, right? Okay. We're not going to fight to be anything other than, you know, a separate finger, and it's fine, right? Anyone who wants more are just a bunch of rabble-rousers and troublemakers. You don't have to listen to them, right? So, of course, DuBois, you know, has some concerns about these kinds of thoughts. So, and you see this if you look at chapter 3 in the DuBois here, and I can't give you a page number, but yes, it's the second page in of chapter 3, if you want to follow along. Okay, so here he's mentioning Washington by name and calling him out, okay? He says, to gain the sympathy and cooperation of the various elements compromising the white South was Mr. Washington's first task. And this, at the time Tuskegee was founded, seemed for a black man well nigh impossible. And yet 10 years later it was done and the word spoken at Atlanta. In all things purely social, we can be as separate as the five fingers, and yet one as the hand, in all things essential to mutual progress. So just calling out that one specific line, as I pointed out, that metaphor, and saying, whoa, you know, okay. And then, so further into this chapter 3, this is 1, 2, 3, skip ahead 4 or 5 pages. Okay, I'm going to start with a paragraph that begins, then came the Revolution of 1876. 1876 was the end of the official Reconstruction, when Union troops pulled out of the South. You know, integration was the order of the day up until 1876. The North just said, Okay, fine, enough of that. Let the South do its own thing. Pulled out the troops, and then guess what happened? All hell broke loose. Race riots began, meaning white people rioting against black people. That's what we see in Marrow of Tradition. When segregation was enforced, when the Klan arose and was lynching African Americans, thousands in fact. So it was 1876 was the beginning of a terrible, terrible time in American history. And so DuBois is talking about this here. But Booker T. Washington arose as essentially the leader, not of one race, but two. A compromiser between South and North, and the Negro, right? Naturally, the Negroes resented, at first bitterly, signs of compromise which surrendered their civil and political rights, even though this was to be exchanged for larger chances of economic development. The rich and dominating North, however, was not only weary of the race problem, but was investing largely in Southern enterprises. So the black community was just thrown under the bus, even by the North in these years. Thus, by national opinion, the Negroes began to recognize Mr. Washington's leadership, and the voice of criticism was hushed. Okay, and then this is the result of Washington's leadership. What happened to the African American community when the focus was on, do only blue-collar jobs, don't advocate for any more, including education, including voting rights, build up wealth, and that's one way you're going to establish your security, okay? This is and that actually did happen. Black people were gaining more property and wealth in these years. But when it came to education, voting rights, basic civil rights, basic protection of self, freedom from terrorism and lynching, that did not happen, folks. Not in these years, not by a long shot. Again, look ahead to Marrow of Tradition, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. Chestnut was not exaggerating. That I promise you. Okay. Mr. Washington distinctly asks that black people give up, at least for the present, three things. First, political power. No voting, right? Second, insistence on civil rights. You're second-class citizens, right? Okay. Third, higher education of Negro youth. That didn't happen either, right? In fact, the Klan, we saw Pap's tirade, we can't have this educated black man. When you would have a school being built for black people, they were often firebombed. Okay. Higher education for Negro youth, and concentrate all their energies on industrial education, the accumulation of wealth, and the conciliation of the South. This policy has been courageously and insistently advocated, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so what is the result of this over the past, 30 years or so? Do we have anything to brag about with after Washington's leadership? This is what we've got, DuBois is saying. 1, the disenfranchisement of the Negro. 2, the legal creation of a distinct status of civil inferiority for the Negro, right? And it was going to take until the 1960s with Martin Luther King to get rid of that segregation garbage that began in these years that DuBois is talking about. 3, the steady withdrawal of aid from institutions for the higher training of the Negro. So black people were not having access to higher education. Okay, so these are the effects of his plan, Washington's leadership, I should say. Okay, and then so the final effects of all this, if you look over on page 48, what is the final effects of this? This is the last paragraphs then of chapter 3. So far as Mr. Washington apologizes for injustice, North or South, does not rightly value the privilege and duty of voting, belittles the emasculating effects of caste distinctions, and opposes the higher training and ambition of our brighter minds, so far as he, the South, or the nation does this, we must unceasingly and firmly oppose them. Kind of rouses the heart here, doesn't it? By every civilized and peaceful method, we must strive for the rights which the world accords to men, clinging unwaveringly to those great words which the sons of the fathers would fain forget. Now he's quoting from the Declaration of Independence. So this is what's remarkable about DuBois. And I said this somewhere in the Canvas discussion, that DuBois is saying that equality for all Americans, it's an essentially American virtue. If you're committing injustice upon any people based solely on the color of their skin or their race or ethnicity, and it has nothing to do with their guilt or innocence or anything like that, that is fundamentally un-American. And as long as we allow that un-American injustice to exist in our nation, all of us have failed as Americans. It's that simple, folks. So let me read this. Then he quotes right out of the Declaration of Independence. And yeah, okay. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If you care what it is to be an American, if these American virtues matter to you, you ought to be ashamed of yourself if you're not allowing others, everyone in this country, to have access to these same rights. It's fundamentally un-American. Okay, I will leave you with this thought, and there will be a short part 3.